So you see, by 1830, there were 94,000 tons of sugar produced annually in Cuba by over 1,000 mills. But with the introduction of the trains, they were able to combine the number of mills. And so 64 years later, it was 1,000,000 tons of sugar with only 500 mills rather than over 1,000. So sugar was part of the power of rum and the triangle trade. To make rum, what they did was they fermented 1.5 gallons of sugarcane molasses with yeast to create a wash that was distilled into 1 gallon of rum. And so the triangle trade was bringing the molasses and sugar from the West Indies, from the Caribbean, up to North America and often to the Boston area, where they would cook the molasses down into rum. And part of the reason for that was because of the really good lumber that was required for that much heat and fire to create the rum. And then the rum and sugar was taken to Great Britain and Spain and sold there. And then those empty ships would go back to West Africa. Well, they would take firearms, cloth, salt, etc., back to West Africa in trade for slaves, and then bring the slaves across to the Caribbean. So different kinds of rum. Havana Club is the brand of rum that is made in the primary brand made in Cuba, and it is not sold in the US because of the Cuban embargo. So you can get Havana Club rum when you go to the beach in Mexico and other places, but not in the United States. So you'll look for the white Añejo Tres, the 3-year rum, is best for your mojitos. The Añejo Especial, the dark rum, is good for your Cuba Libres. And your Añejo Siete, your 7-year rum, is good for, Añejo Siete is good for sipping rum. So it is legal to bring rum and cigars back from Cuba to the US. The only restriction is that it has to be, what is an amount for personal consumption. So you should not bring, well, you can't bring enough rum or cigars to sell in a store, but whatever you can justify in your suitcase, you can do, as long as it is in checked baggage, because this is going to be more than 3 ounces of rum. So tobacco. So tobacco is primarily grown on the western side of the island because the soil is perfect, as well as the humidity and the rainfall. Tobacco originally came from South America between 3000 and 2000 BC. The indigenous people, or Aborigines, considered tobacco a miraculous medicine, and it's an essential element in religious, political, and social ceremonies. At the beginning of the 17th century, Cuban cigars became popular worldwide. And in 1717, King Philip V established a royal monopoly on tobacco growing in Cuba, so that only Spain could sell Cuban tobacco around the world. The monopoly remained in effect for 100 years, and it was one of the reasons that Cubans really rebelled against Spanish control over their country. So Cuban tobacco was sold out of Spanish ports around the world. They did not use slaves in growing tobacco. Sugarcane was not a delicate crop, and so that's why slaves were used for that. But tobacco is a delicate crop, and so they brought immigrants from the Canary Islands to work in the tobacco fields. By 1859, there were nearly 10,000 tobacco plantations, and in Havana alone, 1,300 cigar factories. Cuba is very close to the Tropic of Cancer, so this western region has a relative humidity of 79%, an average temperature of 77 degrees, and a particularly favorable amount of rainfall. The chemical composition in the soil of this part of Cuba is very special, And after the Cuban Revolution, when Castro took over, many of the tobacco plantation owners fled to other parts, to other countries, and they took with them these special seeds of Cuban tobacco to grow in Central America, other Caribbean islands, or in the southeast of the US. But what they found is they just couldn't replicate it. And so Cubans will tell you that the soil in this part of Cuba is very special. So what kind of tobacco, what kind of cigar should you get when you go to Cuba? Well, cigar aficionados that have gone on our trips all have different opinions. What is most popular and well known are Cohiba cigars, the one with the yellow and black label. Um, and you cannot buy Cuban cigars in the US. But when you go into a cigar store, even in Denver, you'll find Cohibas. But then when you look closely, you'll see, oh, they were grown in Nicaragua, they were grown in Dominican Republic. So Cohiba is a brand that is grown in other areas, but Cuban Cohibas are particularly special. So any cigar shop that you go into in Cuba, the people working in the shop will give you different advice. And some people like to buy a couple different kinds of cigars and try them out during the trip to see what their favorite is. Plan to spend about, for a Cohiba cigar, purchased individually, plan to spend about $10 a piece. The others are a little bit less expensive. And then, of course, when you buy them in quantity, buy a box of 6 or 12 cigars, you'll get even better deals. So the Wars of Independence. First, we had the 10 Years' War, and that was from 1868 to 1878. And the 10 Years' War ended in a truce with Spain promising reforms and greater autonomy for Cuba. But what this did was this began the era of wars and the ideas that the Cubans had of maybe we could fight a war against Spain and be able to have complete control over our country. In 1886 was when slavery was finally abolished in Cuba. And 1895 to 1898 is very important because that's when Jose Marti led the Second War of Independence. And the US got involved and helped declare war on Spain to help Cuba get its independence. So who is Jose Marti? When you go to Cuba, you will see his face. You'll see bronze statues everywhere. Even the national, lots of buildings are named after Jose Marti, including the airport in Havana. So Jose Marti lived from 1853 to 1895. He was a man of letters who died a patriot's death in battlefield. What's ironic is that he was a writer, a poet, and is famous for his literary prowess. But he really inspired the first battles of the war for Cuban independence. But he was not a soldier, and he was actually killed in his very first battle. So he's often called the Apostle of the Revolution. He was often exiled from Cuba because of his rebellion against Spain. And he was first exiled in 1871. And he lived in Mexico, he lived in the US. In 1895, he returned to Cuba to help fight for its independence. His writings were about the prevention of any one class or group from taking total control of the country. His writings served as an inspiration for many revolutionaries, including for Fidel Castro. And he was considered the father of modernism in Latin American literature. He predated and influenced Rubén Darío from Nicaragua and other poets. So the Spanish-American War. Here you see a picture of the USS Maine entering Havana in 1898. The Cuban struggle for independence captured the imagination for years of Americans, and newspapers had many articles agitating for the U.S. to get involved and to intervene in Cuba's battle for independence. So in early 1898, the U.S. felt pressured to help out Cubans, and so they sent the USS Maine to Havana just to be there as a holding block, just a symbol of, yeah, sure, we'll help, without big intentions of getting involved. But 3 weeks after its arrival in the harbor, it exploded. This happened at 9:40 p.m. when the crew was on the ship, sound asleep. And there are many reasons, many theories as to why the ship blew up. So you'll see on the slide that there were more than 5,000 long tons of powder charges on the vessel. So when it blew up, it was a huge explosion. And the 266 U.S. soldiers were killed in this. One of the theories was that Spain had put mines in the harbor, and that was what caused it to blow up. But the most popular theory is that there was probably a careless sailor whose cigarette detonated the explosion. But this began the cry of "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," and caused the U.S. to truly jump in and get involved in the war. So by 1898, Cuba became free of Spain with the U.S.'s help. And so the Platt Amendment was set in place. And the Platt Amendment had several conditions, but one was that the U.S. forces would get involved and would help Cuba establish its government. And in return, the U.S. would purchase sugar from Cuba. So what was intended to be a few years of the U.S. helping Cuba get its government set up turned into a lengthy amount of time of really the U.S. becoming a new imperialist over Cuba. So the U.S. really controlled the government until 1934, so nearly 36 years. Now, from 1933 to 36, Cuba had 7 different presidents. Nobody really stuck until Fulgencio Batista came to power. He was elected president in 1940, heavily backed by the United States CIA. During his 12 years, or during his term, which was 4 years, there was a lot of corruption, and action groups or gangs shot their way through politics in the city streets. In 1944, when Batista's term ended, he went and he lived in Florida, and he invested huge sums of money that he had acquired while being president in Cuba. During the 8 years that Batista was out of office, there was a huge resurgence of corruption and a breakdown of public services in Cuba. So in 1952, Batista led a coup d'etat to take back his state. So rather than going through dual elections, he led a coup d'etat and overthrew the current president, who was Carlos Prios Socaras. Socaras was known to say, fine, you can have this, and he took off and fled the country. But Batista's presidency was marred with violence. He was known as a brutal dictator. He controlled the university, the press, and the Congress, and he embezzled huge sums of money. He was president until 1959. Now, Batista dug his own grave on this one, because by taking over the government in a coup d'etat, he established the notion among Cubans that, oh, if somebody wants to take over the government, they can just do a violent takeover. And that laid the ground for Castro's revolution. This is the end of the first section of history. And later you'll see there's another video and another set of notes for history 1950s to the present.